Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marvin Kalb, director of the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. Our topic this evening is governing and informing in the era of discontent. Now, I think we all know that for much of American history, the glass has always been half full rather than half empty, and sometimes even brimming over. Look back 100 years ago when the Turnout thesis suggested boundless opportunities for the American people, a rich country, and the idea was that one generation was going to get inevitably better than the one before. And this feeling held, I think, up until a decade or two ago, after Vietnam and after Watergate, when that look of eternal confidence on Uncle Sam's face seemed to turn into a question mark about the future of this country. Recent polls suggest that the American people are indeed anxious about jobs and concerned about the future of their lives and their children's lives. Last week, right here in this forum, Professor Michael Sandel's new book was celebrated, and that book is called Democracy's Discontent. And yet in today's Wall Street Journal, a lead editorial quotes a new report from the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank that suggests that far from the U.S. losing jobs and opportunities, it's actually gaining jobs and opportunities, and many people in 1975, according to this editorial, who were in the lowest economic brackets have actually moved into the middle class and some even into the upper classes. And so what is the truth, and what are we to make of this state right now of America's condition? We hear a great deal about a lack of faith, a lack of trust in institutions. Our panel, I have absolute confidence, will of course provide the light for us, and I start on my immediate left, Derek Bach, who is the 300th anniversary university professor here at Harvard. For 20 years, of course, he was president of the university, and before that, dean of the Harvard Law School. He is the author of many books, most recently, The Cost of Talent, How Executives and Professionals Are Paid and How It Affects America. Robert Blendon is chairman of the Department of Public Health and Management of the School of Public Health and the Robert I. Lee Professor of Health Policy and Management. He serves as a professor of health policy and political analysis in both the School of Public Health and here in the Kennedy School of Government. Professor Blendon is working on a long survey on American attitudes for the Henry J. Kaiser Foundation, and this series of surveys is appearing in the Washington Post. Barbara Nelson is Vice President and Distinguished Professor of Public Policy at Radcliffe College. She has also taught at Princeton and the University of Minnesota and has written very extensively. She's currently engaged in two projects, at the same time, two projects. The Practical Politics of Diversity, Policymaking for the 21st Century, and the other one is called Women, Immigration, and Public Policy. Maxine Isaacs is a lecturer here at the Kennedy School, teaching courses on political campaigns. Her PhD is from the University of Maryland, and once upon a time, she was press secretary and deputy campaign manager for Walter Mondale's presidential campaign way back in 1984. And finally, Andrew Kohut, who is director of the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press. It used to be called the Los Angeles Times Mirror Center for the People and the Press. In 1989, he founded the Princeton Survey Research Associates, specializing in public policy polls, the press, and politics. He's appeared frequently on radio and television, analyzing the results of his surveys. Let's start first with Professor Blendon, who will give us a rundown on some of the latest poll results and give us a sense of the impact that this focus that we have tonight on a loss of faith and trust in the institutions of government and what impact that is having on government itself.
Let's see if we can get this to go on. Okay, we're okay.
There you go. quickly, I'm just going to try to use a little bit of data to help you with an issue that most people are familiar with. And it grows from this post series that I had the privilege to work on. First is, the question we asked is, everybody knows that public confidence in government fell between Vietnam and Watergate. And if you read Seymour Lipset's book, it's the classic on the confidence gap. The question is, 22 years is a long time to have a negative memory. And why for 22 years not only didn't we feel better about the government, but actually it's gotten worse. So that was the question. And just quickly, we don't have lots of trend lines for 22 years. So that's the first is the general trust measure. The second asks a question about if it isn't what I'm saying, please wave your hand. It should say a great deal of confidence for the Congress and executive group. As you can see, it really went down by 74, and it's not a terrific point to be in at the moment. The next point I want to make is, when people in polling ask people why they don't trust the government, they have a standard set of answers. They tell you it's waste, fraud, and abuse. They tell you that you're spending money on the wrong issues, that it's too much interest groups, and this is pretty standard across the line. And this is what we got in our survey. But the thing I want to add to it is that the people who told us that they did not, they thought that government couldn't be trusted because it wasted money, it was mismanaged, spent things on the wrong thing, with too much interest groups. If the knowledge slide is there, basically what we found is that their impressions have nothing to do with their experience. So that slide should say is that people honestly said to us, my impression of the federal government has nothing to do with my personal experience. It comes from the media. Which we gave them a long list of how, including, the MCI question, friends and family. And people just said right away, I don't have any real experience. The second thing is, we said to them, this is an America which just told us that government is spending money on the wrong things, it's mismanaged, that they obviously must be very attentive to feel so strongly that they don't trust government. And the point I want to make, what we just took selective things, though they feel this way, 90% didn't know the budget had been reduced since Clinton took office. The majority of people think the number of federal employees have increased. Half the population thinks that Congress passed term limits. In the middle of the most visible Medicare debate, most people thought foreign aid was dramatically larger in the federal budget than Medicare. After Speaker Gingrich appeared on time as the man of the year, almost half the nation couldn't identify the Speaker of the House. The leading Senate candidate for the President of the United States, when asked who is the Senate Majority Leader, 2/3 of Americans could not answer, even though he was in the press as that. The point I want to make is not knowledge, but the same people that just told us they didn't trust the government because it's mismanaged and everything aren't very attentive to what's going on. So their views of government cannot be from what they know of what's going on a day-to-day basis. And the point I think that struck us, and there are two things that just came out, and then I'm going to quit. The first is that when we asked people about the major problems that face their lives, that slide should tell you that they think that every single one of them got worse. What's important is we secretly asked them things that got better, like the quality of air and the economic situation of the elderly. They just believe every one of them got worse. The second one asks whether or not the federal government programs over the last 20 years has contributed to improving these situations. And if you need your glasses, the slide should say to you that no one believes that federal efforts have in any way improved the major problems. And on the economy, over half the public, when given a wide range of choices, believes that the federal government actually made the economy worse. Not just didn't do anything to improve it, actually made the government worse. So the point I want to make is what we found is that though people don't pay a lot of attention to what government does, that they think that the problems that affect their lives have gotten worse. Government has spent a lot of money. It hasn't improved anything. Therefore, they assume that everything is being wasted, mismanagement. But it is the problems, the big problems in their life that they don't see getting better, that really looks to us that's driving. And if I'm correct, that should be the military slide up there. Is that the military slide up there? The point we wanted to make was the only area where the public thinks government has had a big success in 20 years is the crowd that you would never hear discussed in 1974. The military has had a swing, as Andy would say, it really does correspond to the war. So the point we want to make is that the trust in government, and let's not talk about the $400 hammer and everything else. Why do we trust the military? Are they better managed? Our conclusion was that the failure of government is tied to a perception that we're failing the problems. And then one other point, and we had a tough time to figure what to do with this. While there is a sense that government has failed in public policy, there's also a sense in our survey that people don't trust each other the same way they used to. And we're not sure how that relates. There is an association, but we're in an environment where your personal trust of people you know is down, and that may aggregate. So the only thing I want to, I guess, leave those of us who deal with the government issue is that it's a big mistake to believe that we don't trust government based on what people know we do on a day-to-day basis. Whatever the failure is much broader and relates to a sense of how government has failed us.
Thank you very much. Andy Kohut, you work with numbers. Do your numbers conform to Blenden's numbers?
Sort of. Since the mid-1980s, we have been measuring the mood of America in a very systematic way. Each year we do a very major survey, sometimes as many as 4,000 or 5,000 people, asking the same questions about values and people's contents and discontents. And over the years, we've charted the nature of the discontent that Bob was talking about. As a nation, we are much angrier and mistrustful of politicians than we were in 1987, and consistently so each year. We're less in favor of government solutions to social problems, economic problems, all kinds of problems than they were in the mid-1980s. We're more anxious about the future than we were. We're less interested in social progress here at home, and we're certainly less interested in what's going on in the larger world. Quite a portrait of collectively of discontent in some sense. But this comprehensive survey also shows a lot of things that haven't changed since 1987. It's been very consistent. In a number of ways, Americans still feel a great sense of empowerment. They feel that hard work pays off. They feel that they're in charge of their own destinies. Low wage growth has taken away some of that, but by and large, especially compared to Europeans, Americans have a sense of self-empowerment. People continue to express strong religious faith. They're patriotic. They have a strong belief that this country can solve its problems, and these measures and attitudes are unchanged over the years. Further, when we ask people, are they satisfied with the way things go, carrying on in their own conditions in their own community, by and large, 70% say they're satisfied, compared to only 25% who say that about the country. And when we say, well, how are things going in your own life, largely people say they're satisfied. Clearly, there's more satisfaction at home, closer to home, and in the things that are more personal than there is in the larger, scary world out there that is less satisfactory and less interesting to Americans now than it was 10 years ago. And if we add to that, to this notion of an era of that we're in an era of discontent, that the American public has been very, very careful about the changes that it embraces. It rejected, so far at least, has rejected the Republicans as being too radical. It rejected the Clintons' efforts to reform health care reform as too costly. And the presidential candidates that it's chosen this year by virtue of a process that it at least accepts tacitly, it has produced more or less mainstream candidates this year, the previous year, and I suspect in years to come. So are these the earmarks of a society that is discontented? I'm not so sure. It's certainly the earmarks of a society that's frustrated and anxious. And there are lots of reasons for frustration and anxiety that we see, and the lack of trust that Bob is measuring. Certainly, the globalization of our economy has made people anxious. The end of the Cold War has raised questions about leadership. I think there's the issue of our national leadership is a real one and one that bothers people. And there's also the news media, because it's the news media that provides the window on this larger world that's so scary to people. And I think it would be too pat to say that the frustrations and discontents with the government that people don't see is just a matter of media negativism or the media being cynical. I think it also has to do with how much media there is and how much information there is about what goes on, and that's what the American public is reacting to. Public life and national life is conducted under a national microscope. And we as a nation are constantly seeing the way the sausage is made in a way that was not the case 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And I think a lot of the frustrations that that are registering in my polling and what Bob is talking about reflects that. And I think that's the quotation marks, Marvin, that I would put around the numbers.
Thank you very much. Derek Bach, all of the numbers, whether we do have the quotation marks around the pessimism and the lack of trust or not, is almost certainly going to have an impact on the way in which the government functions and about popular perceptions of the way in which the government functions. So your thoughts on those questions.
Good. I think Marvin asked me to speak to the subject since I was the only person within reach who had actually tried to govern an institution under conditions of extreme distrust. And it is not altogether a pleasant experience, but that's not the effect that I want to speak about. Actually, I think we should note some effects that don't seem to be taking place because they provide a ray of optimism in an otherwise bleak picture. One is that we would be in very bad shape if people's distrust about government and their very low opinion about politicians and bureaucrats caused them to have a diminishing faith in our democratic system of government. That does not appear to be the case either here or in Europe, where there's also a problem of trust. Something like 84% of the American public, the last time I looked, said that the United States had the best system of government in the world, and I think the rest of them answered a slightly less enthusiastic version of that, which was some other countries have pretty good systems, but ours is as good as any. So there's almost no one who feels that there's a real problem with the system. The problem in their eyes are the people who operate the system, but not the system itself. It doesn't seem to make a difference to people's voting. Although voting has declined in the United States, I've never seen a link between distrust and voting. There's a lot of evidence the other way. There isn't too much of a sign that distrust and which you would think would breed a kind of contempt for authority, and that would lead to greater declines in behavior, respect for law, things of that kind. It's not clear that's not so, but many forms of personal behavior have actually gotten somewhat better in this country since the mid-'70s, even though trust has continued to decline, which makes it look like the two are not too closely related. That would be very serious, of course, if a huge decline in trust were closely linked to willingness to play by the rules. We would be in very bad shape indeed. But I do think it does have some effects, and let me just quickly tick them off and then subside. I think we've got pretty good evidence that voter distrust leads to greater resistance to new programs that either add bureaucracy or spend money. And that obviously is a big burden if you try to think about reforming the healthcare system in ways that neither create bureaucracy nor spend money. It's quite a difficult feat. There's probably greater resistance to tax increases if you think, as most Americans do, that the government wastes 48 cents out of every dollar. You're obviously not too enthusiastic about proposals to raise your taxes. There is, I think, a greater tendency in an era of distrust to attack, to disparage your opponents, to run by attacking Congress. Even if you're a member of Congress, you try to say you're one of the outsiders and you trash the institution. So a kind of vicious circle sets in where even the people who ought to be defending the institutions are attacking them. I think there's also some evidence from my own studies that people who distrust government are more likely to favor magic bullet remedies, term limits, a balanced budget amendment, third-party candidacy, and there's always the danger if distrust gets too great that more and more extreme remedies may begin to attract a following. But the last thing I would mention, which perhaps I come to because I'm a lawyer, but I can't prove this, but I very strongly suspect that there's a connection. If you look at what's happened since the trust began to erode in this country, a number of things which you would expect to have happened have actually occurred. First of all, there's a lot more litigation. There's a lot more challenging the government, not just challenging the government, challenging all the institutions who have lost trust. I mean, one reason you have so much malpractice litigation now is because the trust in your doctor is not what it used to be. There was practically no malpractice when I went to law school, and I think it's very much a function of a loss of trust in the medical profession. But there's a lot more litigation against the government. There's a lot closer scrutiny by courts of what administrative agencies do. There's the so-called hard look doctrine, which again is a product of distrust. We're no longer going to take on faith because they're supposedly experts and specialists what agencies do. We're going to look at them much more closely. There's a lot more red tape because in an era of distrust, of course, the media react to that. You get more investigative reporting. There's more likelihood of scandal. You protect yourself against scandal by more and more layers of review to make sure that some silly subordinate doesn't do some stupid thing that's going to get you hauled up in front of a congressional committee. And therefore, you get more and more layers of red tape, more delay. More of the things that make people upset at bureaucracies. So that when Mr. Gore says in his plan to streamline government that we must empower the line officials of this country and take off these layers of review that are cramping their creativity in solving the country's problems, it's a very good sentiment, but in today's distrustful atmosphere, very difficult to achieve because those layers of review are there precisely because people are so afraid of the consequences of mistakes in an era of distrust when they are pounced on and made much of by opponents to a public that is all too ready to believe the worst about what is going on. So I think actually the effects are quite serious in hampering the overall effectiveness of government, even though faith in the system itself remains quite unimpaired.
Thank you, Derek, very much. Maxine Isaacs, do you share Derek Spock's vision? And how would you tie it into the 96 campaign if I asked you to please do that?
Okay. I come at it from a different perspective, and I guess that's what you'd call the political perspective or the practitioner perspective or something like that, this kind of a question, because I start from Bob Blenden's assertion, and that which is made by many other people, that the public is not attentive and not informed. And I have to tell you that a politician looks at the public and they don't believe that. They think it's a chore to get people engaged, but they don't believe they spend a campaign going where the voters are and trying to get them engaged in issues. And the idea that people are turning away in droves or are too cynical to participate or too uninformed it's an interesting question, because in a political world you sort of take that as a given that people are going to engage, and then you go on to the next question. But in an academic world, or even the way the media look at the public, they look at these data and they say, oh well, nobody's engaged, and then they go on. So we're sort of a two parallel universe kind of a situation. So that was one of the questions I wanted to talk about, because the electorate, I would argue, in this campaign is quite engaged. The turnout in the early primaries was very high. It was higher than it had been in New Hampshire in a generation. It dropped off quickly because there was no more contest. There's no rational reason for people to continue to be engaged at a heavy level when there's no reason to. Andy Kohut had predicted earlier today that he thinks the turnout in 96 is going to be higher than it was in 92, which was higher than that had been in a generation, and stopped a steady decline in turnout for the last, I guess, 88 was a low of 50%, and in 92 it was 55%. So there's sort of a disconnect that's going on here, and I wanted to address that a little bit and talk about it in the context of this campaign. I'm not going to argue that the public is well informed. Obviously, you can't argue that when you're asking them these kinds of questions. The question is whether or not the public has sufficient information to make the kind of judgments they need to make in a democracy and do their jobs as citizens. And basically what we require of them in this system is that they vote and that they have enough information on which to base a vote. Now, how they get to that information, as some of you who have looked into this know, they use shortcuts to get the information. They get it from a variety of sources. They may get it from a spouse. They may get it from a brother-in-law. They may get it from an anecdotal tale on television. But they do assemble enough information to make a rational choice. And if you probe that choice, you'll find that there's enough that the information on which they base their choice may not be all that different from somebody who spends several weeks studying the issues and approaching it from that perspective. The person who's doing the most work on this right now is Doris Graber, who unfortunately isn't here tonight, but she's the Lombard professor this year in the Shorenstein Center, and what she has found is that there's several things, but I'll run through them very quickly. First, in the natural course of things, most people's conversation will not turn to politics first, second, or third. People will talk about other things, and they're interested in other things. However, when they are asked about questions in which they have about matters in which they have some interest or have some personal stake, they not only show a fairly high level of information, but show the ability to make fairly complex arguments. And she's got a standard by which to judge this, which involves complex reasoning and measuring that in almost a psychological sense. She's contended that the most important requirement of citizens in democracy is that they vote, and then the question becomes what information do they need in order to carry out that task. And she's argued, and this goes to some of the things that Bob was talking about earlier, that it's not necessary when you're casting your vote for president to know who the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is. It even may not even be necessary to know which party is in. I would argue it wasn't necessary to know which party is in control of the House or the Senate. Therefore, she's contending people are being asked the wrong questions, the wrong set of questions about what they're being quizzed. They're being asked the wrong quiz. They're being asked a quiz for a course they didn't happen to take. And that if they're planning to vote for president and then you were to ask them a series of questions related to that vote, that they would do pretty well. Moreover, in this, if you focus on what people don't know, which is what Bob was talking about, you can get very discouraged. You say, but there's some. I found there are some fairly encouraging numbers if you look at what people do know. The fact that 86%, I thought this was a high number, know who was president at the time of the Watergate scandal. That 62% know that Republicans hold a majority in the Senate, and that more than half of the people know that it's the job of the Supreme Court, rather than the other branches of government, to know whether a law is constitutional. Now, you can make a normative case, as Bob has done, and I'm familiar with the argument, that it's the responsibility of citizens in a democracy to know more about those issues that we debate here in forums like this, like the federal budget deficit, or what the proportion of Medicare or Social Security is in the federal budget. But that's not the same thing as arguing whether people have enough information to make an intelligent choice in a democratic society. And I guess I'll stop there and turn it back to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Max. Barbara Nelson, you have spent a lot of time in your own research looking into areas of diversity, gender, women's issues. Listening to all of this, do all of these numbers make sense to you? Do they conform, in fact, to the results of your own work?
These figures, which those of us on the table have had the opportunity to look at, are like trying to make a road map of a village standing on the mountaintop a little bit far away. So the picture I'm going to give you is a picture of impressions, not so much a picture of details. But as I read the material and as I thought about this important question, there seemed to me to be three kinds of discontent happening as picked up by this survey. The discontent is made up of distrust, both of government and of other people, and about worry of concerning the future. And I have named these three kinds of discontent for animals. I think this has to do with taking my nieces and nephews to the zoo recently. Ostrich discontent, mountain goat discontent, and zebra discontent. Let me explain. Ostrich discontent is what we heard about the first part of this discussion. That's where people don't know much, but they have a lot of opinions. It's sort of like, I don't know what art is, but I know what I like. I don't know what pornography is, but I know what I don't want. There's a lot of ostrich discontent, people putting their heads in the sand and not knowing about government, at least in the take a quiz sense, and still having views about how well government is working. The gender gap issue around that is that the material we see is that women know less than men when you ask them 20 questions. My guess is that when the scholars begin to look at this in more detail, what we're going to find is that women who are in the labor force know about as much as men in the labor force, and that it's not being in the labor force. That's been the traditional explanation for differences in political knowledge in the literature. Let me go to mountain goat discontent. Mountain goat discontent is predicated on the image of mountain goats coming together and clashing, horns clashing, each one trying to dominate over the other. If you read the really excellent set of articles in the Washington Post and look at the marginals for the survey, what you see is a growing and rather dramatic what's in it for me, put number one first, definition of a response to issues of trust. That leads to, what I call the 50% rule. 50% of just about everybody says that they don't trust government very much. They don't trust other people not to cheat them very much. You have really extraordinary bifurcation between the trustful and the mistrustful. What it has led to is an unwillingness to think about other people and to worry about what will happen to other people. This isn't altogether without a basis in material reality. Two of the things that I really liked in terms of indicators in the material was that 19 liked in the sense that they were, liked in the sense that they were instructive, not liked because of the findings, as you will just see. 19% of the respondents said that they had been a victim of a physical assault or a robbery. The way the question was asked, this is a prevalence measure, not an incidence measure. It's a forever measure, anytime in your life measure. That's 1 in 5. That's an extraordinary measure to get 19%, and it's probably higher because the question is asked in a very nonspecific way. Again, 47% had been the victim of a property crime within their lives. That's almost 50%. We're talking about a lot of material reasons to be somewhat mistrustful. It may be that prevalence is more important than incidence, that crime is one-time learning, and that there's a reason for some of this mountain goat conflictual sense of discontent. The data we have don't tell us whether there are any differences between men and women in this, but they do tell us something interesting about zebra discontent. Zebra discontent is where the herd tries to protect the young. If you've been watching the recent Subaru commercials, you see a pack of zebra, or whatever the multiple of zebras are, running across the Serengeti with the young zebras in the middle and the older zebras on the outside. And what you're supposed to take away from this is that if you own a Subaru, you too can follow the pack of zebras across the Serengeti. But the larger message of the zebras are that they're herd animals, and herd animals protect their young. There is a very interesting piece of gender information from the most recent survey around zebra discontent. If you ask these two questions, does government, what percentage of the time do you trust government? A lot, some, not at all. And do you think the economy is getting better? And you put the negative, people who have answered both of those questions in the negative together, you get 31% of the respondents, or if we believe the survey, 31% of the adult population. Of that 31%, 65% are women. Or another way of saying it is that we've got, let me just check my notes, we've got 20% of the adult population are women who answer that they both don't trust government and they think the economy is getting worse. But if you ask them why they don't trust government and think the economy is getting worse, they don't say, because I'm not getting mine. They say, because we're not taking care of the disadvantaged. This is a very interesting group. 20% of the adult population are women who think that we're not meeting our us obligations. They're not saying what's in it for me, they're saying what's in it for us. My guess, and this is left for my friends who will actually analyze the data, is that these are people who will probably support Bill Clinton in the next election, even though you might not think so in the first instance. Of the two likely candidates for president, he is much more of a what's in it for us, we're all in it together kind of candidate than is Bob Dole. And they are an interesting group to watch. They may be a good deal of the gender gap.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with a couple of questions of our panelists and ask them if they would like to ask one another questions, because this is an opportunity to do so. But you all have an opportunity as well to ask the panel questions, and there are two microphones here. So starting now, if you do have a question, go over to the microphone and I will recognize you. But first, do you all have a question you'd like to address to one another?
I want to just underscore something. I just found it marvelous when you were talking about the nature of this. We have reprints of the Washington Post series here. Do you have them too?
Yes.
And it says, America losing trust in each other and institutions, and under that, 3 found slain on road in Beltsville. I mean, that makes your point.
Yeah, but 3 have always been found dead in Beltsville. I mean, they were found dead before the, quote, era of discontent got started. And we start this also, I don't see anybody here, so I'll just ask my question here. We're starting with a presumption in this discussion tonight that this, we say, governing and informing in the era of discontent, as if it is a recognized and accepted notion that we all live in an era of discontent, and people from one end of the spectrum to the other are very unhappy. And I have a feeling that the numbers that you have in the poll definitely bear that out. But there are other numbers that suggest a whole range of different attitudes. And I also have this sense that in a macro, in a universal going beyond the United States, a point that Derek was getting at before, I think, and that is that people are looking toward the American form of government, not with discontent, but with envy all over the world as the form of government that they would like in their own societies. Now, that doesn't mean that the American people have to share that view, but that is a factor all over the world today in global politics and recognized as such. And the other point that Derek started with is that people do support this form of government, and they are, I think Andy was saying, patriotic, having pride in the government itself.
I think that in the broadest sense that the system...
In the broadest sense itself. So how are we going to, I mean, maybe this is an era of discontent, but I wonder about the, and I also wonder how we mesh these two ideas. I think they're really two clashing visions of what is going on in this country. Bob?
First, because I come from a health field, narrow diagnoses are very important to me. I think what the data basically says is we don't trust the government. However, we're very satisfied with our personal lives. Also, Americans are extraordinarily conservative about changing institutions. Even people who want all these wonderful constitutional changes, often in the middle of a debate, will stop supporting them. So what you have is we distrust the institution of government. There are other things going on in our lives. The distrust issue matters only if, once in office, it's important to you that the public supports you. And that's the point I want to make. Where Maxine and I probably disagree is you can go vote for anybody and not know a lot, not even trust them. However, if it matters when you're president that public opinion supports your economic, health, welfare position, what we now have is that knowing very little, your average citizen will say you got it wrong. That's what this is about. It's not about the falling apart of the rest of the society. However, if you're in government, it's very, very real. If Derek was made a secretary tomorrow, a week from now, I'll do a poll, and he got it wrong. And he was president of Harvard. So the mood means that when you're in government, you got it wrong. And that's a very different question many of these other issues about satisfied with life or general direction or something. It's the government's actions that we're very concerned about, and that is a narrower range of activities, but it does affect politics.
Max?
A question for Bob, following up on what you just said. How can you say that we don't want to, that Americans aren't willing to change their institutions when we've been through the 94 election was in fact a massive institutional change. It wasn't, it's not, it doesn't, I'm not talking about democratic principles, but I'm talking about institutional change, where they took 40 years of precedent and just tossed it out the window very casually, and I might add very happily. I mean, after that election, they were quite satisfied with that result, and felt that they had done something, that finally done something to sort of take power into their own hands and effect some change.
I think it really is a major change. Throwing the incumbents out is a very different thing to people than any of the proposals for changing structurally the government. So I think they felt incredibly good about throwing the incumbents out. But I don't think they saw it as a structural change.
But that is the structural change that's within their realm. It's within their reach. That's the kind of structural change they can effect, and in fact they did.
But they were quick to back off that change. I mean, by mid-1995, people were saying, whoa, wait a minute, we're moving too fast. Just as by mid-1994, the public was, early 1994, the public was saying the Clintons are moving too fast. I mean, they ask for change on the one hand, and if people are really discontented, there would be a greater inclination to go for these changes which are seen by the public as too radical.
But they aren't, there's no indication that they want to go back to what they had before, right? I mean that the putting the Republicans in power in the House and the Senate is still something that they're not regretting. They don't like the agenda.
Not completely.
Right. But I mean, I think it's still an open question.
Derek?
I think it's really quite different, and I'm a little more pessimistic about getting out of this mood about government, because I think the public is not only greatly misinformed, and I think that has more severe consequences than you do. I agree you can make do with very little information when you're voting for a candidate. If, as is increasingly the case, lawmakers are taking polls of people about how they feel about issues, when there isn't an election that they've had to prepare for, and when, I mean, there's simply no way that if 72% feel that you're spending more on foreign aid than you are on health care, and that welfare is the biggest item in the budget, it seems to me that you can respond, no matter what cues you have and who your father-in-law is, that you can respond intelligently to polls about how big to make the welfare budget, or whether we should have more foreign aid, or what to do about health care, because the basic facts are simply that are critical to a decision are out of whack. But the reason I feel pessimistic is because I do believe that very large numbers of Americans have a problem we haven't mentioned tonight, and that is they have a set of inconsistent and ambivalent views about what they want out of government, which makes it very difficult to satisfy them. I mean, they have very large aims for society. They want security. They want universal opportunity. They want prosperity. They want individual liberty. They want high standards of personal conduct and so forth. Many of those aims have never been achieved by any country in the world without a large government. But they have a profound distrust about government and wish it were smaller and do not really want to support it. They want more services, but they want less taxes. They want more protection from a whole host of things, from impurities in the air, imperfections in their food, all sorts of other things, but they want less regulation. And they feel there's far too much kind of government rules and regulation. And for that reason, it seems to me both the Democrats and the Republicans are likely to be disappointed. I mean, Clinton came in and thought there was a mandate to do some big things, particularly health care, and then the public really wasn't supporting that. Then Gingrich comes in with the Republicans, and they feel we've got a mandate. What we really want to do is to slim back government. But they forgot the fact that the people still have these large aspirations for what kind of a society they want. And they don't want the services cut back, although they would like somehow government to be cut back. And therefore, the moment there seemed to be a real possibility that the Republicans might enact some of these things about environmental regulations and cutting back various other programs. The opposition began to rise steadily. That being so, what makes me somewhat pessimistic is it's not altogether clear to me what a government is going to do to rebuild the confidence of the American people, so long as they want so many things that are hard to reconcile all at the same time.
You know, I was just thinking, Derek, that in my own lifetime, the only block of time when I think the American people had enormous confidence, if not in government itself, then in the nation, was in that period of the 50s, when there was enormous economic growth, when cities were being rebuilt, suburbs were being built, cars were being built, everybody had jobs, people were going to school. You didn't have that sense of discontent that we're talking about now, but I wonder to what extent the discontent simply is a function of the way in which people in this country, anyway, observe their government. There has been discontent and even distrust with central authority in this government even before the government was formed, and that's why it was formed in the way that it was, so that there could be ways in which the people were always keeping a check on what these dreadful people in government were about to do. And I wonder if we're not setting up some kind of a straw man here, that there was a moment in our lives that we can look back to and say, here, we had trust in government. We had trust in government during World War II, sure. We didn't have trust in government for a large part of the 1920s and 30s for totally different reasons. But I want to get Leslie Goodman involved in this too. Leslie?
Actually, it's a little bit off the point of what you just raised, so if somebody wants to respond to you, I wanted to probe a little more deeply into the
Andy,
gender gap.
I wanted to respond to your discontent with the public, because I don't think the problem rests with the public. I mean, the public does want it all, but the public has always wanted it all. What's different now is that political leaders don't get up and say, you can't have it all. If you want something achieved in this area, well, then you're going to have to make a certain kind of sacrifice. No one says that anymore. It wasn't said by Clinton with regard to health care, and it wasn't said by Gingrich with regard to scaling back government. So naturally, people's instincts to want a free ride and a free lunch are being exploited and are in play here in a way that they perhaps wouldn't be with better leadership or more
Barbara
honest
Nelson,
leadership.
would you like to come in?
Not at this point.
Not at this point. Then Leslie, you shot.
My question is about the gender gap, and we've heard a lot about this growing disparity and how it's widening, and I guess it's a two-part question. One is, it's been my impression, perhaps false, that the gender gap ultimately closes in national elections and doesn't end up being this extremely large difference, but it really drives to a larger question, which is, I don't see women as having these divergently different views on issues relating to things like government. And I'm wondering if you all could respond, if more women are in the workplace, if that's where we're getting our information, if their lifestyles, at least to a great extent, seem to be more parallel to male lifestyles, what is it that they are not liking specifically, where their discontent comes from? And is it the message, or is it these white male messengers that have been, created these demonic images around that they're rejecting? Because at least from a California perspective, the working poor California mother is damn angry about subsidizing somebody who isn't working and staying at home on welfare. And the whole issue of they're kicking people off and leaving them on the streets, I don't think plays as much. So I'm interested in probing anybody that has anything to add on this gender gap, and is it really widening, and what's going on?
Barbara, you take the first stab, please.
The gender gap, as we see it in the newspaper, is composed of two things. It's composed of a different preference for parties and candidates among women and men. Regrettably, the electorate that actually goes to the poll and those that get polled by pollsters are not the same. And so what you get is a much narrower effect of sex differences on elections than you do on opinions. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there are really good data that demonstrate that the gender gap is really a policy gap, that the policy gap is about what might in other instances be called feminist views of the world, views that encompass a sense of being together, of investing in health and education and welfare, of being in favor of fairness and controlling environmental degradation. Those views are more prevalent among women than among men, and they are what drive the gender gap. However, all the people who have those views tend to vote for Democrats. Hence, the effect tends to be not so much around gender, but around issues. And we get it in the newspaper as the gender gap.
There's a values gap between men and women. Women are less critical of government, more critical of business, more supportive of social welfare, more supportive of environmentalism. All of the values that push people toward the Democratic Party or the traditional Democratic Party are more apparent in women, and all the values that push people toward the Republican Party are more apparent among men. And it's a very big difference in this country, and I've observed it also in countries, in surveys that I've done in Western Europe and even in Eastern and Central Europe.
Mm-hmm. I address a question of our two pollsters, and then we'll get to you, please. Do you know when the American people had, and I'm not talking about World War II, that's obvious, when did the American people have the kind of confidence and trust in government that could be offset by what it is that you're positing tonight?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to think about that. Bob, can you?
Most of us have real questions about polls. One of the nice things about it is, as long as you run them, you sort of have a trend line. And then you go to historical documents. What we have is some polling during the Great Depression, and then a wonderful time series when Eisenhower was around. And then we have historical documents. They don't relate well to each other. So we know we always had periods of not trusting the government. What we don't know if it was at the 12% level. And we have no way of relating historical documents to this trend line. So you have historical pieces which suggest to you there were periods of distrust, but they don't tell you on a Richter scale if it was here or there. So you're really sort of stuck. We only have this period. We do know in the middle of the Great Depression, guess what? People decided the federal government was better than the state government, and out of desperation, the few questions that are around from that period show increased trust levels, but we don't have anything resembling a really tight time series, and you have no way to go back 100 years and say, how does it appear today that in 1890?
So then we don't know for a fact that what we're observing today is an aberration or consistent with American history.
But we do have, I have a little bit of thought here, we do have one simple indicator that exists since the mid-1930s, and that's the presidential approval ratings. which roughly correlate with satisfaction with the state of the nation and relate to trust in government. And in the 30s and 40s, they were lower than they were in the 50s. The 50s and through the Kennedy years, they reached a high point,
Right.
only to crash with Vietnam and the 60s, and really crash with Watergate, never to recover.
Derek?
I do think that's one very important point to observe. I think there have been many periods in our history when we had great distrust, and there's certainly historical accounts suggesting great distrust even around the time of the General Washington and Jefferson and all those giants of the past. But one big difference, the government did an awful lot less then. And I think what is unprecedented about the last 30 years, it's the only time in our history when the public has really wanted a society that requires a large and active government and has increasingly had less and less confidence in it. And I think that's what makes this a historical moment which is really unlike those of the past, even though there have been times when distrust for government was pretty rampant.
Well,
Marvin, may I add one
Yes.
thing related to what Derek just said? We heard a lot in this last campaign about this idea that somehow the 50s were sort of a magical time, and that was when we all felt better about our country. And a lot of black people will tell you that is really a dangerous notion, and that our romanticizing that era covers up an awful lot of injustice and that was going on, and that what's happening is our society, as it's getting more open, is getting much more complex, and a lot of people have trouble with that.
Yeah, well, it's also true that in the 1950s where a number of things happened which opened up that part of American society as well, starting with the Brown Supreme Court decision and the ways in which the press, and we've done studies on this, the ways in which the press in the 1950s, the difference in the way in which a local television station covered a black problem in the South and the way in which national television covered it was, forgive me, day and night in the way in which there was an approach. Yes, sir, you've been very patient. I'm sorry.
Oh, thanks. My name is Phil Caper, and I teach at the School of Public Health.
You are welcome here, Phil.
Thank you. Glad to be here. My question has to do with if in fact the distrust that's expressed by people is more in the people running the government than the institutions of the government itself, to what extent, and anyone on the panel cares to answer this, can that be traced to the apparent lack of a sort of a moral compass on the part of public officials who seem to be responding more to the results of public opinion polls and the kind of instantaneous communication of those results through the mass media than to any consistent set of ethical or moral values? Is that a source of distrust?
Derek.
Well, I think one thing which strikes me, and it's not hard data by any means, but I think there are very few people that I know who have been close to government or a part of government over a long period of time who don't believe that the quality of people elected to public office in Washington has improved. In fact, that's the great enigma we have to grapple with. It was once expressed to me by Tip O'Neill when I was in his office late in the day, and I was curious about this because I was very impressed with the people I'd talked to about trying to defend student aid against the onslaughts of the Reagan budget. And so I asked him, during your 30-odd years here, do you feel that the quality of people in the Congress has improved or stayed the same, or do you think it may have deteriorated? He answered immediately, and I've never forgotten it. He said, no question, he said, the quality of people has improved substantially, and the quality of the results has gone down. And I think it's that enigma and trying to understand why that should be so. But I think what you say is right, too, but I think that's another effect of distrust. Right. When there's great distrust out there, you get defensive and you start wondering about how people are going to react to everything you do. And you lose a certain confidence in yourself. You begin to say, well, God, if they're that mad, maybe you don't admit this publicly, but deep down you say, maybe there's something wrong with me. And you then begin watching the polls and doing everything that you say.
Okay, we got a little more than 5 minutes to go, and we have at least two people ready to ask questions. Please, go ahead.
I'd like to expand the question of just confidence and distrust and go back to the issue of how much do citizens know about their government and how important is that in facing the complex problems that we have before us. What do we know historically, if anything, about some of the data that was referred to in terms of the level of knowledge about the basic functioning of government and whether that's changed over time? And are any of you willing to bring the media back more into this and television back into this discussion?
May I take a crack at that? So far as we know from the various studies that are around, the American people today know more about their country, their government, and the rest of the world than they ever have before in their history. And that is a result of all of the new technology, and by new I mean the emergence of television and everything else that followed. People are now instantaneously connected with different parts of the world. Annie Kohut made a point earlier on that we are seeing how sausage is being made. We actually know so much more about the process of government that might in fact have spilled off the kind of discontent with government. Because you'd like it all to be as marvelous as our dreams about democracy. But when you look at the way in which it happens, it's pretty tough. Senator Simpson is going to be coming here to teach a class next year. And I asked him the other day, what do you want to teach the class? What do you want to call the class? And he says, the creating of legislation. I said, what do you mean by creating? And he said, it is just so incredibly difficult. And I just want to try to explain to students how difficult it is, so that at the end of the day, when you have the legislation, and you kind of take it for granted, I want them to go through the process and marvel at the wonder of the creation of legislation. In other words, the way in which democracy works. So I think there's a lot here, in my view anyway, to the way in which the press today is so central a factor in our lives. And it plays on things that in 30, 40, 50, or 100 years ago we didn't know as much about. And we lived in a kind of ignorance. But we don't live in that ignorance anymore. That's one of the things that comes up here, that the essence of the Washington Post polling data is that there is an enormous amount of ignorance. True, there is, but I suspect that's always been the case. But more people today know more about their government, their country, and the world than they ever have. Just, it's there. Yes, sir.
I'm Miles Shore. I'm visiting scholar here. And Bob's data confirm what we all know, and that is that the media have a tremendous influence on what people know and also the level of discontent. I'm just curious if each of you was either the publisher of a major newspaper or the head of a major television network, what would you do to influence the situation for the better?
That's a terrific question. I mean, most of the people in journalism today are agonizing about just that point. They really are. There's a lot of discussion, sort of journalistic seminars, taking place in newsrooms all over the country. In the local station here at Channel 4, there is a young man named David Brown who is the director of the station, and he has called several times, and he said, we keep having meetings about ways of improving our coverage. Do you watch us? Yes, I do. What do you think we can do better? And I get letters like that and calls from a lot of people. It is happening, even at the network level. Paragraph. I just don't see it, actually, in what happens. Derek, please.
I'm the least experienced here, but if I had to hazard a guess why you don't see it on the screen, it's because of a set of forces that don't get talked about very much by the Jim Fallows and others who write books about why the media don't behave more responsibly. Because the media are, in the end, and I don't know how else you would constitute them in our society, they are corporations. They're owned by people who are interested in a certain rate of return. They, particularly in television, have very, very careful idea about exactly how many people are turning on and off the set, even at points during the program. And through a process of trial and error, they get to know an awful lot about not what people say they would like, but what they really will keep their sets turned on to. And I am afraid that that has driven television very much, and also to some extent the news, into shorter, snappier bits of news, more human interest, more horse race, more scandal, more of all the things that we deplore. And I think we should remind the media of their responsibilities and try to shore up that side of it. But it would be unrealistic not to understand the economic forces that are pressing them to give the public what it wishes it didn't want, but ultimately seems to turn on its set for or read the paper for. And
let me add something to that. In recent conversations with some folks at National Public Radio, they talk about captive audiences. A huge percentage of the people who listen to, who get their news from National Public Radio, get it in the car, and they talk quite frankly about being able to have a longer amount of time to cover a topic, because although they might change the station, they're not likely to get out of the car. So there's a kind of captive audience quality to this. You can not only change your station at home on your TV, but you can go and eat ice cream as well.
Let's remember also 100 years ago there was something called yellow journalism. If you think today is bad in terms of its preoccupation with sex, violence, sensationalism, believe me, this is responsible journalism when compared with what existed here 100 years ago, or during the Jackson administration, or during George Washington's administration. We expect of the press today more than we ever expected of the press before in American history. We expect more of them than they are capable of giving us. And because they are so central a force in American life, we naturally want more from them. But they can't deliver at the level of our expectation. It's just not going to happen. Yes, Bob. We got about 2 minutes.
I'm in incrementalism. I think the press could make a small but vital contribution by doing context around the issues it covered. And I'm talking about 30 seconds. Newt Gingrich has a job. In the focus groups I ran, people disliked him, didn't know what he worked. He was the mouthpiece for the Republicans. Did he have a job? No. They never heard what his job was. In Bosnia, a number of press are now doing it. I believe when you look at the polling data, you will find a large number of Americans believe Bosnia is on another continent. I don't mean to make this funny. The press can put in a map. A simple map on another continent from where it is. Right, you're correct. See, context is everything. But a little map which says where it is would influence exactly where it is. And how many people, I believe, can't answer that. Same thing with Bob Dole. People knew who Bob Dole was, but they never heard he had a job. He was a senator. He talked a lot, and he ran. They said he always ran. What was his job? We said, what did he do? Nobody said that. The news could have 13 seconds that said he is the leader of the Republicans in the Senate. So at least you do that. The Clinton bill, a line that says, what is it? It is the context issues which would permit people to take things away that would make it a little bit easier to have these dialogues.
I absolutely, totally agree. Last question.
Yeah, very briefly, and following along the same lines. It really just has to do with the press's overwhelming preoccupation with bad news. And I guess what I hear you saying is that if the press were to do a story, even a snippet on the wonder of the creation of legislation, or on the good news that was just on the screen. I mean, the most stunning statistic there was the story of clean air. We've made enormous progress. Is it that it's not economical for the press to tell a good news story, or is it that the government is just so bad at marketing its successes, like the progress we've made on clean air? And is there any hope to turn that around?
I don't know about the hope of turning it around, but you sound to me exactly like every single government official I have ever talked to over the last 40 years. You go to a government official and why didn't you say, I mean, my speech yesterday, you didn't report it. It was brilliant. I mean, didn't you read it? And what about this positive side? And couldn't you have said, and all of that? And Max was in the middle of all this during the campaign and knows exactly that line. There is always discontent, and has been from the first day a newspaper was published in this country, with the quality of the newspaper. Now, Blendon says, give us some more context. Absolutely, give us more, by all means. There ought to be more, but there are stories about the environment. There really are.
Right, but
We
that's
don't have
what's so
the
stunning,
time
though,
to read all of this stuff.
but that was just so striking that people don't get it.
No,
So is it
I-
that the press is doing it and people aren't absorbing it?
And they're not absorbing it, and it's an interesting question as to why they're not, but I'm quite certain that Professor Bach has the answer.
Or thinks he does. Yes. No, I just wanted to say something, in your behalf, because I think everything Marvin has said is correct, but there are pretty good statistics that show, for example, if you look at the coverage of Congress, that I think it was 2 out of 3 stories were negative in the 60s, and 3 out of 4 in the 70s, and then it got higher in the 80s, and it's 9 out of 10 stories about Congress were negative. And it seems to be very difficult to really make a serious argument that Congress deteriorated over that period of time. I mean, it's not inconceivable, but I would be very doubtful that it was that. Something is happening, and which I think is sort of market-driven, as I say. It's that somehow negative stories attract people's attention more than positive stories, and you can do lots of things in your mind that are good illustrations about, trying to write stories about dog doesn't bite man or whatever. But I do think it would be an interesting thing for the Shorenstein Center and the Nieman Program and other universities to try to figure out how not to cut down on negative news. That's very important, that investigative side. But how could we try to make positive news more interesting? And the reason you want to do that is not just for some sort of warm, cuddly uplift or serving the nation by making people feel better. It's because if you just do what's newsworthy, you don't give a balanced picture of the world. And that's what the media are really supposed to do, to give you an accurate picture of the world.
No, they're not.
No, I don't. I think if you...
I mean, where is it written that the American press has to give you a balanced, fair picture of the world?
Well,
In the press. The
I
newspaper
thought
says
the
that all the
media-
time.
Is that what they say?
That's what they say. They're
fits
trying
the
to tell it like it is, as Walter Cronkite used to say. But if the only thing
was
they're
always
telling
right.
you like it is the bad news, you're going to get a very jaundiced view of what's going on. And it seems to me it's just an interesting intellectual challenge. How can we make good news more interesting so that we're not asking the media to cut their throat by inserting something about the positive things that are going on around us?
And that is a huge problem, and we try to handle it every day. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming on our panel this year. You too.
There will be an